In the harsh winter of 1872, a horror stalked the children of Boston's working-class neighborhoods. 7 young boys ages 4 to 9 were found, beaten, tortured, and left to die in ways so brutal they seemed almost unbelievable. Their tiny bodies bore wounds that belied a level of calculated cruelty that defied explanation. But what most terrified this tight-knit community was not the brutal nature of the attacks, but the horrifying realization that the perpetrator was a child. A 12-year-old boy with a distinctive milky eye who would become known throughout New England as the Torture Boy and the Red Devil. The Boston Globe later described the perpetrator as having a personality that seemed to derive pleasure from the suffering of the innocent, while police struggled to understand how a child so young could organize such systematic violence. What you are about to hear is the completely true story of Jesse Harding Pomeroy, who would become the youngest person in Massachusetts history to be convicted of first-degree murder, and the horrific chain of events that turned an abandoned child into what many consider the first documented serial child killer in the United States. The case challenged Victorian beliefs about the innocence of childhood and forced the justice system to confront previously unthinkable questions. Before we continue the story of Jesse Pomeroy and the terror he unleashed on working-class families in Boston, let's take a trip back in time to the grim industrial neighborhood of Charlestown, Massachusetts, where the constant hammering of the shipyard was the harsh soundtrack to the lives of families trying to survive in post-war America. On November 29, 1859, gaslights flickered faintly in the shabby apartment as Ruth Ann Snowman Pomeroy held her newborn son Jesse in her arms for the first time. Her heart broke at the sight in the yellow light. A thick white film covered the boy's right pupil, a rare congenital anomaly. His gaze was ghostly and haunted anyone who laid eyes on him. Medically known as Luca's condition, Jesse's eyes were like dull marble, lifeless and so unsettling that they haunted. The winter wind whistled through the flimsy windows of the cramped apartment as Thomas Jesse Pomeroy, a Civil War veteran who had seen too much death on the battlefields of the South, looked at his son and felt only disgust and disgust. Thomas worked grueling 12-hour shifts at the Charlestown shipyard, his hands forever smelling of grease, his lungs filled with metal dust. But nothing in his miserable life prepared him for the sight of his child with his deformed face. From that moment on, Jesse never received the love, acceptance, or human warmth that any child needs to thrive. Instead, he became a convenient target for his father's anger, a living example of something wrong and shameful in the Pomeroy family. As Jesse grew from baby to toddler to boy, his appearance became increasingly terrifying and haunting to those around him. The white film over his eyes seemed to thicken over the years, making him look unreal and ghostly, frightening children and causing adults to tighten their chants when they passed by. Neighbors whispered that the boy was possessed, and mothers pulled their children close when Jesse passed. The marble-like eyes seemed to penetrate the soul, penetrating into a darkness beyond human understanding. At Charlestown Public School, Jesse became the target of relentless bullying that went far beyond the usual teasing. Children gathered around him in the schoolyard, pointing at his unusual eye, reciting cruel nursery rhymes about Marble Boy and Devil Child. Can you imagine a little kid being brutally bullied while also carrying an abnormality that society would not accept? Like if you feel sorry for Jesse, and don't forget to subscribe to follow the whole thrilling story. Jesse's schoolmates not only taunted him verbally, but also tormented him in the most brutal ways, throwing rocks, spitting on him, and excluding him from all games and activities. Teachers, overwhelmed with large classes and short on resources, barely intervened, viewing Jesse as a creepy freak who was best ignored. One teacher later described him as strange, stubborn, not necessarily evil, but completely unapproachable by conventional educational methods. The isolation was profound and devastating. Jesse had no friends, no allies, no one to show him kindness or acceptance. He spent his lunch hours alone, hiding behind the school, reading and rereading the same violent, cheap novels, his only escape from the harsh realities of his life. These cheap publications, which flooded the post-Civil War market, featured scenes of frontier violence, torture, skinning, and brutal clashes between settlers and natives. While most children read these as dramatic adventure stories, Jesse studied them like a scholar, memorizing every detail of the torture and violence described in the gruesome pages. But it was in the Pomeroy house that the real nightmare began. A systematic campaign of abuse had taken shape, shaping Jesse into something horrifying. Thomas Pomeroy, the father, developed a almost ritualistic style of punishment that went far beyond the usual corporal punishment. In a damp wooden barn behind the house, amid the smell of rotting wood and rusty implements, Jesse was forced to strip completely naked while his father prepared the beating. Thomas would choose a whip or a thick belt, testing the weight in his hands while Jesse shivered in the cold. The beatings were methodical, designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. Thomas lashed Jesse's bare skin until blood ran down his small body, all the while berating him about his appearance, his behavior, and his very existence. The psychological torture was even more brutal than the physical pain, a deliberate attempt to break his spirit completely to convince him that Jesse was worthless and unworthy of love or compassion. Jesse's older brother Charles, who was 17 months older, shunned him completely, treating him as if he did not exist. Charles was everything Jesse was not: handsome, normal, socially acceptable, charming to girls, and easily integrated with his peers. In Charles's eyes, Jesse was not just an embarrassment, but a reminder of something dark and shameful in the family bloodline. The brothers shared a room, but Charles often slept on the kitchen floor instead of with his disfigured brother. The only person in Jesse's increasingly isolated world who showed any understanding was his mother, Ruth Ann. But her love was complicated, misguided, and ultimately enabled his son's terrifying behavior. When neighborhood children complained that Jesse was torturing cats, stabbing them to death with kitchen knives, and dumping their bloody bodies in the Mystic River, Ruth Ann convinced herself that it was merely a sign that he was sad and lonely, not a clear warning that something sinister was brewing in his damaged mind. She sat by Jesse's bed after brutal beatings, gently cleaning his wounds, whispering that the world didn't understand him, that he was special and different in ways that others couldn't judge. She nurtured his sense of victimhood while shielding him from the real consequences of his increasingly terrifying behavior. When teachers complained that Jesse didn't fit in with his peers or was absorbed in violent stories, Ruth Ann dismissed it as prejudice because of his appearance. As Jesse turns 12, something fundamental and irreversible begins to take shape inside him. A turning point that leads to the crimes you're about to hear about. Do you feel sorry for Jesse? Or do you sense the darkness growing inside him? Like, if you want to find out more, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this terrifying story. Years of accumulated abuse, isolation, humiliation, and abandonment had transformed Jesse's pain into something else entirely. A consuming, burning thirst to make others suffer as he had. But according to his twisted logic, Jesse's victims would not be the strong men who had tormented him throughout his short life, but the weak, the small, the innocent children, more vulnerable than he had been as a child. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Jesse began observing his young victims with the same intensity he had once devoted to violent, cheap novels. He silently watched children play on the streets of Charlestown, memorizing their habits, their favorite spots, their weaknesses. Jesse practiced winning their trust, practicing smiles, speaking soft words that felt foreign and fake from his lips. By the winter of 1871, when Jesse turned 12, any trace of conscience or compassion he had ever possessed had been erased. The beatings, the isolation, the constant messages that he was worthless and unwanted had created something that was no longer quite human. A predator in childlike disguise, hungry for power and control, like nothing he had ever known. December 26th, 1871, Boxing Day. While most families in Chelsea enjoyed the post-Christmas festivities, sharing leftover turkeys and exchanging small gifts, 4-year-old William Payne was playing alone near his house when he encountered a boy who would change his life forever. Jesse Pomeroy had spent weeks observing William's routine, mastering his daily routine, and planning the perfect attack. Jesse approached, flashing a carefully practiced smile. His pockets were full of candy and small toys he had stolen from the store. His voice was soft and gentle, masking the growing darkness within, promising wonderful games and special gifts if William would follow him to a secret place to play. William, innocent and trusting as only a 4-year-old could be, took Jesse's hand without hesitation. Jesse led his first victim through the winding streets of Chelsea to an abandoned restroom on Powderhorn Hill, which he had surveyed, carefully isolated. No one could hear the screams. The structure was mossy, rotting, surrounded by dead grass and trash, perfect for what Jesse had been secretly preparing for months. Once inside the dark, foul-smelling restroom, Jesse's facade of kindness fell apart. What happened next marked the beginning of one of the most horrific series of crimes in American history. Jesse discovered the absolute pleasure of having complete control over another human being and forced William to strip. He enjoyed watching the confusion and fear grow in the child's eyes as the temperature in the bathroom neared freezing. Jesse pulled out a rope he had brought, tied William's small wrists, and hung him from the ceiling beam. For what felt like hours, Jesse systematically beat William with his hands and the broken wood, savoring every scream, every plea, every sob of pain and confusion. The beatings not only caused physical pain, but also created a feeling of utter helplessness in the victim. Jesse paused between blows to watch William's face, to see the terror rising in the child's eyes, to feel the thrill of controlling someone else's entire experience. For the first time in his life, Jesse felt truly powerful, truly in control of his circumstances. But he did not kill William Payne. Not yet. Perhaps it was because he was afraid of the consequences. Or perhaps a last shred of control that had not been completely destroyed. Instead, Jesse left the boy hanging there semi-conscious, suffering from hypothermia and bruises while he carefully collected the rope and any evidence he could find. The next morning, William was found by searchers after an entire night. He was shivering with cold, covered in bruises, and fighting for his life. Can you imagine the horror William must have felt? Comment below how you feel and subscribe so you don't miss the next events in this chilling story. The decision was driven by the mother's denial, social shame, and a complete misunderstanding of her son. Ruth Ann convinced herself that the attacks were a result of Jesse's bullying and rejection at Chelsea, that removing him from that environment would cause him to revert to normal, childish behavior. She refused to acknowledge that Jesse's behavior was a sign of something much more serious, that her son had become a true predator who derived pleasure from the suffering of innocent children. Thomas Pomeroy had left the family, by this time leaving his wife and children without explanation or contact information. Whether the reason was shame over Jesse's behavior, fear of being implicated, or simply the result of years of unhappiness, his absence left Ruth Ann alone to face her son's growing darkness. The move to South Boston in August 1872 was both quiet and swift. Ruth Ann told her neighbors that she had found a better job across the river. She rented a modest apartment on Broadway Street in a working-class neighborhood where Irish immigrants and Native Americans lived side by side in cramped tenements. But the demons did not disappear simply because of the change of address. If anything, the move to South Boston seemed to have given Jesse more of a sense of recklessness. He knew that his mother would protect him, help him avoid consequences, cover for his every move. That knowledge gave him a sense of security and confidence that made him even more dangerous than before. Jesse also knew that he was now in new hunting ground, where his reputation was unknown, where his parents had not yet learned to fear the marble-eyed boy. South Boston offered a fresh source of victims and the opportunity to perfect his torture methods without the same vigilance as in Chelsea. The escalation of violence was immediate and horrifying. On August 17, 1872, just 2 weeks after the family moved in, 7-year-old George Pratt was found tortured on the beach in South Boston by fishermen who had come to check their nets in the early morning. The attack was more brutal than anything that had happened in Chelsea, as if Jesse wanted to announce his arrival in the new hunting grounds with unimaginable violence. Jesse not only beat George with his hands and pieces of driftwood, but also bit the child's cheeks and buttocks, leaving bite marks that would haunt the boy for the rest of his life. He scratched George's skin with his fingernails until the blood flowed freely, and stabbed him with needles he carried in his pocket, all in an act of torture. This attack marked a new level of brutal creativity and Jesse's direct participation in the suffering of his victim. While the Chelsea cases were also brutal but somewhat indirect, this one saw Jesse begin to use his own body as a weapon, combining his teeth nails and the tools he carried. The local police were bewildered by the brutality, completely unaware that they were dealing with the same perpetrator who had terrorized Chelsea. Can you imagine the horror George must have gone through? Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to follow the entire chilling story of Jesse Pomeroy. The lack of communication between jurisdictions in the 1870s meant that patterns of attack were not recognized across city limits, giving Jesse a significant advantage in avoiding detection. The escalation of violence continued with a steady, terrifying intensity. On September 11, 1872, 7-year-old Joseph Kennedy was lured from his family home and taken to an abandoned boat shed near the South Boston salt marsh. Jesse had been monitoring the boy's routine for days, noting when he would go out alone to shop for his mother, finding the perfect time and place to kidnap him. The shed was more isolated than the Powderhorn Hill lavatory, surrounded by tall marsh grass that muffled sound and obscured by the terrain. Jesse had prepared everything: rope, knives, and other tools needed for his brutal plan. He repeatedly cut Joseph's face with a pocket knife stolen from a local store, leaving permanent scars. Jesse forced the boy's head into the salt water of the lagoon, repeatedly bringing him to the brink of suffocation and pulling him out, relishing in the terror and despair of his victims. From then on, near drowning became part of Jesse's torture arsenal, a way to create a sense of utter helplessness in his victims. Just 6 days later, on September 17th, railroad workers along the Hartford and Erie line found 5-year-old Robert Gould tied to a telephone pole near the tracks. The boy had been beaten cut with a knife, and Jesse attempted to slit his throat before being frightened away by footsteps. This was the closest Jesse came to killing, suggesting that he was losing any last barrier that would prevent him from killing his victim. This action showed clear intent to kill, and it was only by luck that Robert Gould survived. But Jesse made a fatal mistake. The 5-year-old boy was able to give the police a detailed and accurate description of the perpetrator, including the distinctive marble-like eyes. For the first time, law enforcement had a clear image of the monster they were hunting, and this feature made Jesse instantly identifiable. The police immediately went looking for the boy, matching the description, but the large number of children in the neighborhood and the distrust of the authorities made the search difficult. The Irish immigrant community was especially distrustful of the police and reluctant to cooperate. Meanwhile, Jesse became more dangerous than ever, combining his mother's protectiveness with the sense of power he felt from his attacks to make him almost completely confident. He began to take more risks, staying longer with his victims and leaving more evidence behind. On September 20th, 1872, Jesse Pomeroy made the most fateful decision of his life. As he passed the South Boston Police Station No. 6 on his way back from a field trip, his curiosity drove him to look through the window to see inside. What he saw should have caused him to flee. Inside the station, Joseph Kennedy was detailing the perpetrator and the pain he had endured at the warehouse. But instead of running, Jesse was drawn in, fascinated by the sight of his victim after the horror. As soon as Joseph saw the horrifying white eye through the window, he screamed and pointed with extreme fear, making all the officers understand what was happening. "That's him. That's the boy who hurt me. That marble eye." The officers immediately surrounded Jesse 13 before he could react. When questioned directly about the attacks, Jesse did not deny, did not quibble, but calmly admitted that he was the torturer without emotion, without remorse, without understanding the extent of his crimes. One by one, the surviving victims were brought to the police station for identification, each pointing with fear and certainty to the horrifying white eye. The pattern of attacks in Chelsea and South Boston became clear, and the police realized they were not hunting an adult, but a child whose capacity for cruelty far exceeded anything they had experienced before. On September 24th, 1872, Jesse stood before juvenile judge William G. Forsyth, a courtroom packed with parents and the public eager to see the face of the monster who had sown terror. The newspapers reported every detail. Jesse stood there unflinching, unafraid, unashamed, unrepentant, recounting each torture in a cold voice that sent shivers down the spines of all present. Judge Forsyth, faced with an unprecedented crime, sentenced him to 6 years in the Westboro State Reformatory, the maximum sentence for a juvenile offender. The community breathed a sigh of relief, believing that the torture boy had been caught and could no longer harm anyone. But they were wrong. The justice system misread Jesse, thinking he was a troubled child who could be rehabilitated with education. In reality, they were dealing with a truly evil individual whose capacity for violence only increased with time and opportunity. Westboro State Reformatory was designed to rehabilitate juvenile delinquents through education, religious teachings, and manual labor. The philosophy of the institution was fundamentally optimistic. Any child could be saved if given proper guidance and moral education. Jesse Pomeroy understood the system's expectations and played his part perfectly. He diligently attended classes, attended religious services, and showed what seemed like sincere remorse for his previous atrocities. School staff noted his intelligence, eagerness to learn, and exemplary behavior throughout his time in correctional service. But it was all an elaborate performance, calculated to achieve Jesse's one goal. He learned to say exactly what others wanted to hear, mirroring their expectations and beliefs, appearing completely changed, while the darkness and desire to torture children remained. His time at Westboro taught him the skills of manipulation and deception lessons that would make Jesse more dangerous than ever after his release. Meanwhile, Ruth Ann Pomeroy never intended for her son to complete his full 6-year sentence. She immediately began a campaign for Jesse's early release, visiting him regularly and reporting to school officials on his progress. She presented herself as a devoted mother, saying that her son had been badly affected by his environment, but was now truly reformed and ready to return to society. Ruth Ann's efforts were aided by the biases and limitations of the reform school. The staff genuinely believed in the ability to rehabilitate juvenile delinquents and tended to see signs of improvement where none existed. Jesse's intelligence and cooperative demeanor convinced them that he was a success story for the school's methods. Through constant lobbying, pleading, and manipulation of the system, Ruth Ann convinced the authorities that Jesse had been successfully rehabilitated. Officials noted his exemplary behavior, academic progress, and feigned remorse as evidence that the school's intervention had effectively resolved the problems that led to his violence. In February 1874, after serving only 17 months of his 6-year sentence, 14-year-old Jesse Pomeroy was released on parole to his mother in South Boston. The decision was based on the belief that he had been fundamentally changed by his reformatory experience and was no longer a danger to the community. Ruth Ann used this time to establish a new business, opening a small tailoring shop at 327 Broadway Street, serving working-class South Boston families with basic alterations and low-cost tailoring. Jesse was put to work alongside his mother, while his brother Charles ran a small newsstand nearby. To neighbors and customers, they appeared to be a normal family, trying to make ends meet after personal tragedy. No one in the community knew about Jesse's criminal past or what led to his imprisonment. The family was allowed to start over with a clean slate without warning anyone of the potential dangers in the neighborhood. But Jesse's hunger for violence did not wane during the months of restraint. His experience in Westboro had taught him to be more careful, more cunning, and more skillful at deception, but it had not diminished his need to torture and dominate others. If anything, the forced restraint had fueled his hunger, making him more determined than ever to satisfy it. Less than a month after his release, the killing spree began again. But this time, there would be no survivors to identify or report. Jesse Pomeroy was ready to move from torture to murder. March 18, 1874. Can you imagine what it was like when Jesse first left Westboro? With freedom, his hunger for violence still undiminished. Comment your thoughts now and subscribe so you don't miss the next part. When Jesse takes on the path of true murder, it was a crisp early spring morning in South Boston as 10-year-old Katie Curran prepared to leave her family's small apartment for what seemed like a simple task. She had been saving up every penny she had earned for weeks, helping her neighbors with chores. And today, she finally had enough to buy a new notebook for school. Katie was a bright, cheerful child, beloved by everyone in her neighborhood. With her dark hair and sparkling eyes, she approached life with a pure innocence that made adults smile and remember their own childhoods. Katie's parents, Irish immigrants who had come to America seeking better opportunities for their children, had worked hard to give Katie the education they never had. The notebook Katie wanted was more than just a school supply. It was a symbol of hope, of belief in the power of education to lift her out of poverty. She was excited about the gift for days, imagining how she would organize her lessons and practice her handwriting in the new notebook. On her way down Broadway, Katie passed Ruth Ann Pomeroy's small sewing shop, where she had visited with her mother. Jesse Pomeroy was standing behind the counter that day, helping customers and arranging merchandise, while his mother busied herself in the back room. When Katie entered the shop, her bright smile and friendly greeting stirred a dark, terrifying darkness in Jesse that had been building up for weeks since his release from Westboro. What happened next in that small sewing shop is never fully revealed to Jesse, but we do know that Katie never left the shop, never visited other shops on her planned route, and never came home to show off her new notebook. The manner of Katie's murder remains a mystery, but based on Jesse's later crimes and established patterns of behavior, we can imagine the terror and pain she endured in her final moments. We know for certain that Jesse killed Katie in the store itself, then faced the urgent problem of hiding the evidence. Quickly and methodically, he buried Katie's body in the basement ash pile, which had accumulated from the coal and wood used to heat the harsh Boston winters. The hiding was hasty and imperfect, but it was enough to prevent immediate discovery. When Katie did not return home that night, the family immediately organized search parties throughout South Boston. The Irish community banded together with dozens of neighbors, combing every nook and cranny basement abandoned building, anywhere the child might have gotten lost or been in danger. The police were notified and began a systematic investigation, checking every store Katie might have visited on her shopping trip. When they arrived at Ruth Ann Pomeroy's sewing shop, both Jesse and his mother were interviewed about their encounter with the girl. Jesse showed remarkable composure and cunning, explaining that Katie had stopped by the shop, bought a few small items for her mother, and left safely. His story was convincing, detailed, and presented with the proper concern for the missing girl. Ruth Ann completely corroborated her son, saying that she had been working in the back room but had observed Katie's visit and could confirm that she had left safely. When the police asked to search the shop, mother and son agreed immediately, confident that Katie's hidden body would not be discovered by a cursory search. The police search seemed thorough, but was far from thorough, focusing on areas where a surviving child might have hidden or where signs of foul play were more likely. They searched the main floor of the store, the back office, even down into the basement. But the ash heap where Katie had been buried was just another pile of household trash. Jesse watched the search, appearing concerned and helpful, pointing out areas the police should check and hoping Katie would be found safe. His performance was so convincing that the police left without suspecting anything about the Pomeroys. But in reality, Katie's body was still lying at their feet, decomposing day by day, while they questioned and checked everything around them. Jesse had just committed his first murder and successfully concealed the evidence, all while maintaining the facade of an innocent teenager concerned about his missing neighbor. This victory filled Jesse with confidence and a sense of invulnerability, a dangerous belief that would lead to his ultimate downfall. He killed a child, hid the body, lied to the police, and walked away with impunity. In his own twisted logic, this proved that he was smarter than the authorities and could continue killing without being caught. But the horror in South Boston was only just beginning to mount. If this story is making your hair stand on end, share this video with your friends who love dark mysteries, like to support the content, and subscribe to never miss a story like this one. Just 5 weeks after Katie Curran disappeared, Jesse's bloodlust had reached its peak. His success in covering up his first murder had given him dangerous confidence, but also awakened an even stronger desire for violence and control. This time, he would not be satisfied with a quick death in his mother's store. This time, Jesse wanted to savor every moment of the victim's terror and pain, a form of prolonged torture that had been impossible in Katie's case. Jesse had been observing the potential victim for days, learning the routine, looking for the perfect opportunity. He had learned valuable lessons from previous crimes about time, place, and the importance of avoiding witnesses. And now, he was ready to carry out his ultimate sadistic desire. April 22th, 1874, a warm spring afternoon. 4-year-old Horace Milan played near his family's cramped apartment. Horace was a handsome child with blonde curls and bright blue eyes, an angelic appearance that made strangers smile and comment on his cuteness. His parents, John and Leonora Milan, were poor but devoted to their son. When an older boy approached Horace, he felt neither fear nor suspicion. Jesse had perfected his approach after months of practice, his soft voice and friendly demeanor winning the trust of children. He offered Horace candy, promising to show him something special that only good children get to see. Neighbors later recounted that Horace happily took the killer's hand, completely trusting, completely innocent. Walking into a world of horror, Jesse led Horace through the winding streets of South Boston to the isolated swamps of Dorchester Bay, where the city gave way to salt water and tall grass. This was an area he had researched thoroughly, completely isolated, where screams could not reach anyone, and he could satisfy all his sick desires. For more than an hour on foot, Jesse maintained his good-natured and enthusiastic facade, continuing to promise Horace wonderful things. The 4-year-old boy chatted happily, completely unaware that he was walking toward death. When he reached the swamp, Jesse's mask of humanity completely collapsed. What happened to Horace over the next few hours was one of the most brutal and perverse murders in American criminal history, an act of violence so brutal that it defied the understanding of human nature at the time. Jesse began by stripping Horace, leaving him naked and shivering in the cool air. This action both eliminated evidence and created a sense of maximum helplessness. What followed was a systematic campaign of torture that demonstrated a complete lack of humanity and a genuine pleasure in inflicting pain. He used his own knife to carve X-shaped marks into Horace's body, creating dozens of precise wounds that maximized pain while avoiding immediate death. The community's anger and demand for justice was absolute and unyielding. Jesse Pomeroy would stand trial for the murders of Katie Curran and Horace Milan, becoming the youngest person in Massachusetts history to face first-degree murder charges in an adult court. On December 9th and 10th, 1874, the Massachusetts Supreme Court in Suffolk County became the stage for one of the most sensational and closely watched trials in American legal history. The defendant was a 15-year-old boy whose crimes shocked not only Boston, but the entire nation, raising profound questions about childhood innocence and the nature of evil. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, legal experts, and curious citizens eager to witness this unprecedented legal proceeding. People from other states had come to watch the trial of the youngest person ever convicted of first-degree murder, and the press reported every detail. Jesse sat in the dock, his terrifying white eyes scanning the room completely impassive, showing no sign of emotion or remorse. Though he had grown taller after months in jail awaiting trial, his face retained the youthfulness of his youth, creating a chilling contrast between his childish appearance and the inhuman brutality of the crimes he had committed. The prosecution, led by the Attorney General, faced a relatively easy but serious task, presenting overwhelming evidence of Jesse's guilt. The case was built in detail, tightly, and irrefutably based on physical evidence, witness testimony, and Jesse's own confession. Witnesses took the stand, describing the escalating pattern of violence Jesse had committed against children. From the Chelsea attacks to the South Boston murders, survivors of the earlier attacks now, adults still scarred, both physically and psychologically, provide chilling accounts of the pain they endured. The physical evidence is presented in painful detail. Blood on Jesse's clothes that matches Horace Milan's blood type. Footprints at the crime scene. Scratches on Jesse's body that match the victim's desperate struggle. Each piece of evidence is carefully catalogued and explained, building an irrefutable case. Most shocking is Jesse's confession, as cold and emotionless as when he committed the crimes. When asked why he killed, Jesse replied, "I don't know why I did it. Something made me do it." This explanation does not convince anyone, but only makes everyone more certain that the boy is different from normal people. Defense attorney Charles Robinson faced a nearly impossible task: how to defend a child who had confessed to the most brutal murders imaginable. How to create sympathy for someone who violated every moral principle of humanity. The defense strategy focused on Jesse's age and mental state, arguing that no child could be held solely responsible for such extreme acts of violence. They presented evidence of his difficult childhood abuse and social isolation, as well as the argument that he was mentally ill at the time of the crimes. Psychologists were called to testify about his mental condition and the potential medical causes of his violent behavior. However, the insanity defense failed in the face of evidence that Jesse planned, carefully had a clear sense of right and wrong, and deliberately avoided detection. The way he calculated and carried out the torture and murder showed a level of calculation that went beyond insanity, undermining any argument of mental abnormality. The jury, composed of 12 men, representing the moral conscience of the community, listened to days of questioning with growing horror and outrage. They looked into Jesse's cold, calculating eyes and saw something beyond ordinary criminal behavior. They believed that this was the embodiment of pure evil in human form. On December 10th, 1874, after several hours of deliberation, while a crowd gathered outside the courthouse, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. However, recognizing the unprecedented nature of prosecuting a child for such serious crimes, they recommended leniency because of Jesse's youth. Judge Horace Gray, faced with one of the most difficult sentencing decisions in legal history, read the sentence the law required, but no one really wanted to carry out death by hanging. Jesse Pomeroy, 15, became the youngest person ever sentenced to death in Massachusetts. The verdict sent shockwaves through the legal and public sphere, forcing society to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, mercy, and the appropriate punishment for juveniles, regardless of their crimes. However, executing a 15-year-old boy regardless of his crime was too much for Massachusetts leaders to handle. Governor William Gaston, a man of deep religious convictions and strong moral principles, refused to sign Jesse's death warrant despite enormous public pressure. 3 times the Massachusetts Board of Governors voted on Jesse's fate, and 3 times Gaston refused to authorize the execution of a child. The legal system found Jesse guilty and imposed the ultimate penalty, but the executive branch failed to carry out the sentence. The stalemate lasted nearly 2 years, with Jesse sitting in a death row awaiting execution, while politicians, religious leaders, and legal experts debated the appropriate response to his crimes. The public was deeply divided. One side demanded justice for the victims. The other feared that executing a child would turn society into the monster they sought to punish. Finally, in August 1876, the Board of Governors voted a 3rd time, this time anonymously, allowing members to vote their consciences without fear of political repercussions. By the narrowest of margins, they decided to commute Jesse's sentence to life in solitary confinement. On September 7, 1876, just 3 months shy of his 17th birthday, Jesse Pomeroy was locked in a small concrete cell at the Massachusetts State Penitentiary in Charlestown, the same neighborhood where he had been born and raised. He would remain in that cell, isolated from all human contact and stripped of most privileges for the next 4 decades. Solitary confinement was both a punishment and a social safeguard, preventing him from escaping or negatively influencing other prisoners. The cell was only 6 by 8 feet, with only a narrow bed, a toilet bucket, and a small shelf for a few personal items. But even behind bars in absolute isolation, Jesse's violent nature and criminal intelligence never diminished. Over the years, he attempted more than a dozen serious escape attempts, each more elaborate and daring than the last. Guards repeatedly found rope iron pens, files, and homemade drills in his cell or hidden on Jesse during routine checks. He had an uncanny ability to turn ordinary objects into tools for cutting metal, picking locks, and drilling through rock. Jesse's escape plots became legendary in the prison system, demonstrating a cunning and tenacity that even the guards admired. In one particularly daring and dangerous escape, Jesse attempted to breach the wall of his cell by rerouting the gas pipe that provided light in the prison. Jesse's explosion not only failed to breach the cell wall, but also cost him his remaining eye, leaving him completely blind for the rest of his life. But even his blindness did not diminish his determination to escape or his ability to cause trouble for his prison guards. Jesse continued to plot and calculate, relying on his other senses and his extraordinary memory to spot opportunities to escape. During his decades in solitary confinement, Jesse demonstrated extraordinary intelligence along with his criminal cunning. He taught himself to read and write in several languages, including Hebrew, German, and French, using books provided by the prison chaplain and education volunteers. Jesse became a proficient poet, writing beautiful and haunting poems about isolation, punishment, and the nature of evil. He also studied law in the prison library and was able to file his own appeals and petitions for clemency. Over the decades, Jesse continued to petition for pardons, reduced sentences, and pardons demonstrating a deep understanding of the law and his constitutional rights. Jesse's legal documents were both rigorous and convincing, and he showed no remorse or responsibility for the suffering he had caused. Prison psychiatrists noted his extraordinary intelligence, complete lack of empathy, and unwavering belief that he had been wrongly or severely convicted. Jesse never understood the pain of his victims' families or realized that his crimes had caused lasting trauma to the community. In 1917, after more than 40 years in solitary confinement, Jesse was transferred to the general prison population, partly because of his old age, 58 years old, and partly because he realized that 40 years of isolation was harsh and inhumane punishment. Initially, Jesse had difficulty adjusting to human contact, but gradually participated in prison programs, even appearing in annual entertainment performances. In public life, Jesse revealed a more humane side. He could be charming, articulate, and develop friendships with long-time inmates thanks to his intelligence and legal knowledge. But those who knew his past were wary because beneath the civilized exterior, there was a sadistic malice. He never truly repented and still saw himself as a victim of injustice. In 1929, Jesse, 70 years old, frail and completely blind, was transferred to Bridgewater Hospital for the criminally insane. He who had terrorized Boston children was finally on the verge of death. Though his body was worn down by decades of imprisonment, Jesse's mind was still filled with the same dark thoughts as when he was a murderer. In his final years, Jesse continued to write poems and letters, maintaining contact with a small group of people interested in his case and his extraordinary intellect. On September 29, 1932, Jesse Pomeroy died peacefully in his sleep at age 72 after 58 years behind bars, the longest in American history at the time. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, without relatives or religious ceremonies. Jesse's name has been resurrected in law textbooks and criminology studies, opening legal precedents for trying juveniles as adults and providing a model for the child killers who would come after him. Unanswered questions remain. Are children born evil? Or is evil shaped by cruel circumstances? What is true justice in the face of unprecedented evil? Jesse. Pomeroy forces us to confront the darkness of human nature, the complex relationship between trauma and violence, and the limits of the legal system. A boy who terrorized an entire city. His name remains one of the most haunting figures in history, a man whose evil was beyond redemption or redemption. What about you? Do you think Jesse was born evil, or was he created by circumstances? Was his lifelong punishment truly just? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like historical horror stories like this, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share with your dark mystery lovers. But even though Jesse Pomeroy is dead, the nightmare he created lives on in the community's memory. The families who lost their children, those who witnessed his brutality, and the legal system are all scarred. Jesse's case remains a reminder of the evil that lurks in people and of how society deals with crimes that are beyond our understanding. As we look back on this story today, we must ask, is there a way to detect and stop evil before it erupts? Or is there some darkness that has always existed, just waiting for an opportunity to rise? Jesse Pomeroy's case is not just a history of crime, but also a mirror of the limits of morality, education, and justice. And as you turn off this video, let that question sink in every community, in every society. What darkness lurks that we have yet to see? Who can protect the innocent before it's too late? If you find this story haunting and want to explore other dark mysteries of history, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share it with people who love terrifying mysteries. Because sometimes stories like this are not just for telling, but also to wake us up to human nature and the evil that always lurks around.